All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Lunch and Learn on the fourth wave of economic development. What does this mean for community economic development practitioners? As a friendly reminder, please be sure to mute your microphones. And as always, you're welcome to ask questions during our presentation. You can either unmute yourself and ask the presenter directly, or you can drop a question into the chat, and we have a few folks that will actually be monitoring the chat who can respond or bring it to the presenter's attention. Briefly, special thanks are in order. Today's Lunch and Learn was made possible in part by a grant from the U.S. Economic Development Administration in support of the EDA University Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And now I will turn to today's presenter, Dr. Steve Deller. Steve is a professor of agricultural and applied economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a community economic development specialist with Extension. His work focuses on modeling community and small regional economies to better understand the changing dynamics of the economy, assess the impact of those changes, and identify local economic strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Today, Steve will share his work on the fourth wave of economic development. And with that, I will now turn it over to our presenter. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Brandon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Brandon mentioned, if you have a question, please drop it in the chat box or go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question. What I'm going to share with you today is a presentation that I gave at the Southern Regional Science Association a couple of months ago. And what I want to try to do is kind of talk about how states and local communities have kind of gone about thinking about economic development, and that we've been through kind of four waves, if you will. Actually, there's been three waves that have been documented. I'm arguing that we're actually in the fourth wave now, and I kind of want to give you an idea of how we got here. One of the problems of talking in terms of waves is you think, well, one wave replaces the next wave. And that's not necessarily true here. What we're seeing essentially is an accumulation of different ways of thinking about it and different strategies around economic development, economic growth that are kind of cumulative, if you will. So you can think of this as kind of an accumulation of different ways of thinking, and how maybe some of the old ways of thinking should be kind of pushed to the side a little bit. So what I want to try to do is kind of give a little bit of a historical perspective here. And I will say start off right away that this original presentation was to an academic group. So there may be a little bit of an academic flair to the presentation today, but I'll try to stay away from too much academic jargon and whatnot. So there is a long tradition in the US to try to influence economic growth. The first documented use of tax incentives was actually the state of New Jersey in 1791 to try to encourage Alexander Hamilton to locate one of his manufacturing firms in New Jersey, to essentially move across the river from New York and start your plant here in New Jersey. The Erie Canal that was completed in 1825 was really kind of the first public works investment that was justified purely on the terms of economic development. Okay, it was justified in terms of a cheap and safe way to transport agricultural products to markets. It was an economic development justification. In 1884, the state of Pennsylvania had invested over $100 million and placed promoters of the state on the board of directors of more than 150 corporations. Again, the idea being trying to promote Pennsylvania over other states. So we have a long tradition of kind of trying to influence economic growth and development, favoring our particular location. Wisconsin historically has not played kind of the economic incentives game. We historically have not played that. That changed with Foxconn. Okay, Wisconsin became very active in trying to encourage the Foxconn development to locate in Wisconsin. It was at the time one of the largest tax incentives that was ever put forward, and it gained national attention. Indeed, it gained international attention. Uh, Big incentives, one in Alabama. The reason I put the Alabama example up here, although it's 1993, is kind of the gamemanship that starts to occur with these tax incentives. Mercedes-Benz made the decision that they wanted to have a manufacturing facility in the US, and they were going to build their SUVs there. And South Carolina had just successfully got BMW to move to South Carolina. So South Carolina was convinced that they were going to be able to convince Mercedes-Benz to locate in South Carolina. Well, Alabama came in and started throwing lots and lots of money on the table to convince Mercedes to move to Alabama. The negotiations got into the silly games. Mercedes had gone ahead and made the decision they were going to move to Alabama, but as long as Alabama kept putting things on the table, Mercedes kept delaying the announcement. And it kind of, the final straw really was the state of Alabama said that they would buy 100 of these Mercedes SUVs to be part of their state vehicle fleet. Now, think about this. You're in Alabama. You work for, say, the Extension Service in Alabama, and you are taking a state vehicle out to work with a community that needs help. Here you are, a state employee showing up in a poor Alabama community driving a brand new Mercedes. How does that go over? The point here is that it gets into kind of silliness with this constantly one-upmanship. The most recent example is Amazon and the location of their headquarter 2, their second world headquarters. They basically put out a 16-page document saying, okay, we're open to incentives. We're open to, well, you could say bribes. And states really started putting together a ton of incentive package. You had towns that actually were going to rename the town to Amazon to try to attract that investment. Okay. These types of incentive deals tend to draw a lot of media attention because they're big, they're flashy. They draw a lot of attention to what the politicians are doing. We're still doing this incentive scheme, but we can trace this back, the current version of this kind of incentive scheme, to the Mississippi Balancing Agriculture Industrial Act of the Great Depression. Doing was essentially they were an agricultural based economy, and at the height of the Great Depression they were saying we've got to do something, and one way that we can do is why don't we get those manufacturing firms that are in the northern states to pick up and move to Mississippi. Well, how are we going to convince them to do that? Okay, they established the idea that a positive business climate around the ideas of cheap labor, cheap land, limited regulations, limited taxes. If you ask somebody, what's a positive business climate? These are the types of characteristics that tend to pop into people's minds. This was the thinking back in the 1930s, and it has spilled over and has been in place for a number of years now. Okay. This was, in essence, the first shot fired between the new war between the states. Um, Mississippi really wasn't that successful. They attracted a few, but really not that many. Okay, most of the manufacturing firms remained in the northern states. Okay, this is the first wave of manufacturing. It drove home the idea of a positive business required cheap labor. This is interpreted today as being unions are bad. Okay, we don't want unions because unions lead to more expensive labor, and that makes for a poorer business climate. Cheap land, low taxes, limited regulations. Okay, in Wisconsin, many of the tax cuts that have been put through since the Walker administration has been driven primarily by this notion of a positive business climate. And this thinking goes back to the 1930s. Okay. But today, a lot of states are still thinking this way. These are some examples from various economic development organizations around the various states. Okay. The Office of the Governor of Texas, the best business climate in the state, one of the lowest overall tax burdens, tax relief, right to work. Right to work is essentially anti-union. Okay, so this way that Texas is promoting itself is very much in line with what Mississippi was trying to do in the 1930s. North Carolina, it's arguing that it has one of the lowest corporate tax rates in the country. Business costs rank among the lowest in the country. There's less red tape and litigation. You could almost put a fifth bullet point there on these characteristics of tort reform. That's another one that's been raised up as another sign of positive business climate. Okay, Florida, pro-business state tax policies, competitive advantage of doing business, streamlined regulatory, insurance tort reform, targeted industrial incentives, right to work, a low tax environment, no personal income tax. These are all the things that the state of Florida is trying to promote in terms of economic development. Relocate your business here, start your business here, because we have a positive business climate. Tennessee, right to work, no personal income taxes. Local tax burdens are among the lowest in the country. Tort and worker compensation laws. Indeed, when VW, Volkswagen, a German company, has a manufacturing facility in Tennessee, and the German model, the way German corporations tend to operate is that there's a very strong relationship between the labor unions and management. Indeed, the labor unions and management kind of view themselves as partners. Unions and management both realize that as the company does better, the employers do better, the laborers do better, and the shareholders do better. So in the German model, Volkswagen wanted the workers to unionize because that's how they conduct their business. So when the state of Tennessee came out and really argued against voting to unionize, that wasn't the company saying that. That was, in essence, the state arguing against unionization in this view of a business climate. Um, the workers voted it down. They said, no, we don't want to do it, because they were convinced that if they voted to unionize, Volkswagen was going to shut down and move. Volkswagen basically was saying, we kind of wanted them to unionize. Idaho, we keep our costs and taxes low. We remove the burdensome regulation. So again, these are all taken from January or February of this year. So many states are still thinking this way, okay? So the first wave, industrial recruitment, focus on manufacturing. What's the engine of economic growth? Manufacturing. Okay, big firms for the focus of attention. What is good for General Motors is good for America. Focus on those big companies, the Foxcons, the Mercedes-Benz, the Amazons. Tax incentives, okay? Throwing money at businesses to move to your state, okay? Public dollars invested in infrastructure. This second comment here is this presentation was after Cynthia Rogers, who's a colleague at Oklahoma, was talking about TIFs in Norman, Oklahoma. But it's essentially back to the Erie Canal. We're investing in infrastructure to improve the business climate of the state. Indeed, when you look at the Foxconn development right now, most of the public money that has gone into Foxconn right now has been in infrastructure, transportation, water, power lines, things like that. Okay. The second wave of development is really focused on smaller businesses, focus more on existing businesses. Okay. What happened is that there was an influential study that was put out by David Birch in the late 1970s, 1981, that kind of challenged the notion that what's good for General Motors is good for America. Kind of said, no, there's stronger evidence that job growth does not come from the large companies, but from small companies. And this work has been confirmed by some other scholars. Some work that Tessa Conroy has been spearheading has shown that this is true for Wisconsin. And essentially, this is growth changes nationally. Now, some of you may have seen this before, but essentially job growth can come from two sources. One is new business formation, okay, entrepreneurship, or existing businesses. The thing with existing businesses, though, is that some of them are adding jobs, some of them are shutting jobs. Some of them are actually closing and laying people off. So what we want to look at is that net change for existing businesses. Now, this is nationally. This is going all the way back to 1979. Historically, existing businesses are shedding more jobs than they're adding. Indeed, if we did not have new business formation, the US economy would be shedding thousands of jobs every year. New business formation is fundamental to job growth and economic development. Okay, David Birch was the first to kind of point to this. Now, economic development practitioners kind of realized this and said that, geez, we really need to kind of start focusing on entrepreneurship and businesses that are in our backyard. Okay, so a lot of communities in Wisconsin have started to adopt this. This is generally referred to as business retention and expansion type of programming. This is the Green Bay Chamber of Commerce, okay? They have a BR&E program, a business retention and expansion program. It's a proactive approach to economic development designed to better understand the challenges and opportunities. And this is a quote, this is cut and pasted from their website, okay? Essentially, what we want to try to do with this kind of a program is that we want to create an environment in our community so that new business formation, how can we facilitate new business formation, and how can we help the existing businesses? Well, one way to do that is to go out and talk to them. Very simple business retention and expansion type program is a business visitation program. This is where an economic development professional, an elected official, maybe a community volunteer, they go in and they simply talk to the local business owners. They say, hi, we're so glad that you're doing business here. We'd love that you're part of our community. How are you doing? And you can engage in a conversation, and you're doing two things. One is you're building a stronger sense of community. If you will, you're building a stronger sense of social capital within the community. You're also identifying potential problem areas. Okay. What are these businesses struggling with? Are these things that businesses are struggling with? Is this something the community can help to address? Okay. So the second wave focuses on smaller businesses, okay? The second thing that's been happening during this time period, late 1970s, early 1980s, is the US economy started shifting away from a goods producing economy to a service producing economy, okay? Prior to the 1980s, almost all the attention was on manufacturing, okay? But something happened. Citibank, which was the first bank to really start kind of Visa, MasterCard credit cards, they kind of spearheaded that, okay? And when they introduced that, they did it in their corporate headquarters in, Wall Street, Manhattan, New York, okay? Because they needed that kind of technical expertise, that network of knowledge to kind of get this new enterprise credit cards up and running. Okay. Once it got established, though, the cost of operating that credit card center was extremely expensive in Wall Street, Wall Street. Okay. So what they did is they decided they were going to pick up and move. They were going to lower their costs by picking a new area. And guess where they picked? They moved to South Dakota. That was a real eye opener. Okay. A lot of economic development practitioners and a lot of academics that study economic development saw this as kind of a seismic shift. One, it made rural appear more competitive. I'm sure that people in South Dakota don't want to say that. But the other thing is that this was not manufacturing. This was service producing. Okay. And if you look at the sources of employment, historically, the number of jobs that are in manufacturing, agriculture, construction has stayed pretty stable. Indeed, nationally, they're declining. The growth is in the service sector. Okay, so this required us to kind of think about business climate differently. Okay, slowly but surely, we're starting to shift in our thinking here. Okay, now the third wave that came forward is this notion of public-private partnership, focus on clusters. Okay, um, I'm sure that most of you on the line have heard of the notion of economic clusters. And economic clusters have been around for decades. Economists that study regional economic growth, community economic growth, have been talking about economic clusters for decades. Indeed, you go back and you read Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, where the notion of the invisible hand came out in 1776. He was talking about economic clusters, okay, in terms of specialization and how an economy grows. So this notion of clusters is not new. But what happened is that Michael Porter reintroduced the idea. And Porter was essentially working with the Economic Development Administration that embraced Porter's notion of clusters. So suddenly, Porter's idea of clusters has been embraced as a way of thinking about economic development. Now, so there's kind of, what is a cluster? Just real quickly, what's a cluster? A cluster is really kind of a geographic concentration of interconnected industries. Okay. A lot of these industries are competitive, they're competitors, but they gain advantages by being in close proximity to each other. They gain that advantage because of a couple of things. One is the input supply chain is a little can be tightened up, right? And secondly, it's what's called thick labor markets. You have you develop this critical mass of workers with the skill sets and the talent sets that are needed for that particular industry. Okay. Now, the second thing that makes for a viable dynamic cluster is that these industries are essentially kind of, or these companies are essentially kind of working together a little bit. They're communicating with each other. It's not just, they're not colluding because that would be illegal. But what they are doing is that they're kind of forming associations. They're kind of meeting in personal environments. They go to the same church. Their kids are on the same soccer team. They kind of meet. They share stuff. Now, what can the government do to help with this? Well, the public sector through the government can help facilitate that networking, and that's where this idea of partnership, public-private partnerships, came from. Okay, so the focus, limited resources on those industrial clusters. If we have limited resources to conduct economic development, do economic development, we want to focus on where we have that comparative advantage, what those clusters are, with an eye towards new and emerging clusters. This is where communities in Wisconsin may be thinking tourism. They may be thinking food processing. They may be thinking other types of development that they have a clear comparative advantage on. Okay, how can we foster this? How can we build on these? What are the new ones? What are the ones coming around the corner? How can we best position ourselves to take advantage of those new opportunities when they present themselves? Okay, networking is key to a dynamic and vibrant clusters. Okay, how many of you heard the phrase, it's not what you know, it's who you know? For a cluster to be viable, these companies have to be kind of sharing information a little bit. Again, they're not colluding because that's illegal. But by these informal networks and sometimes formal networks, information is shared. Okay. They're still competitors, but by sharing information, they can become more innovative. Okay. And the public-private partnerships helps facilitate that process. Invest in public institutions that can support the clusters. For example, in rural communities, if you look at the governor's rural development, or the Rural Blue Ribbon Commission, and I'm going to give a selfish plug here, is investing in extension out of the UW-Madison can help kind of facilitate that, provide research insights, provide data analysis to help this. What can the public do to help facilitate these kind of processes? Okay. Now, where are different economic clusters? This is something that came out of the Michael Porter's group that's out of Harvard University. I think one of the reasons that Porter had such a strong influence is that he was a Harvard economist, and that carries a certain amount of weight. But you can see that there's various clusters that are, around different places. Computer integrated systems and programming engineering is in Colorado. Um, Las Vegas, amusement and casinos and small airlines. You can look, what is Wisconsin, Iowa, agricultural equipment. These are kind of the examples of different kind of industries that have popped out. Okay. Now look at cheese plants. Okay. Where are the cheese plants located? This is simply, every one of these dots is where a cheese plant is located. You wonder why Wisconsin is known as the cheesehead state. Well, we got a real strong cluster of cheese plants. That is a viable, potentially a viable economic cluster for the state of Wisconsin. What can we do to make the cheese industry, the dairy industry, as profitable, as competitive, as innovative as we possibly can? In the last budget go around, the state invested in the Dairy Innovation Hub that was through the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences here on the Madison campus. The state was trying to reinvest in the university and the university's ability to do cutting edge research on dairy related topics. Another one is wineries. I mean, California pops out, but wineries are a little bit more spread out. But look at Colorado, for example. There's a lot of wineries that are popping up in Colorado. Why? Well, think of the customer base. The Pacific Northwest, a lot. You're starting to see them pop up in Wisconsin. Okay, is wineries a possible future economic cluster? Now, this is where, in the western part of the state of Wisconsin, you're seeing these things like wine and cheese trails. This is where the artisan cheese industry is partnering with the winery industry, and a lot of the local breweries are trying to get into that. They're partnering with local bed and breakfasts and other tourist activities, and they're trying to form a viable cluster to attract more tourist dollars into Western Wisconsin because of this kind of cluster of economic activity that we have going on here. Now the challenge is how do we network and facilitate these various economic actors to be able to coordinate and work together? Okay. Now, a viable cluster is more than just, that's kind of what I've already kind of said that a little bit. Okay. It's more than just interconnected through, group supply chains and whatnot. Okay. There's a strong social capital here. Okay. And what I mean by social capital is that there's networking. Okay. The classic example is the Plastics Council that's in central Wisconsin. Okay. A group of plastics manufacturers got together to kind of say, hey, we're competitors, but we're all in the same industry. If we form a plastics council or a plastics association, we can kind of come together to better address our needs. Okay. The Plastics Council of Central Wisconsin is actually pretty effective. They tried to replicate that in the western part of the state and it didn't work. Why? Because of this notion of social capital. Okay. The individual manufacturers did not want to work together. Okay. The other thing that started to come into play here with the Porter cluster notion is that people started to realize that there's lots of things at play here beyond taxes, labor costs, land prices, and regulations. Okay. People started to realize that we need a systems thinking approach. Now, historically, we can go back and look at trends in economic development thinking. And in the 1960s and early 1970s, people tried to tackle community economic development through a holistic approach. Okay. Because there was the environmental movement. movement during that time period. Remember, that's when the EPA was formed. That's when the Clean Air Act was passed. The Clean Water Act was passed. People were trying to address it in a multifaceted way. We moved away from that in the late 70s and 80s because there was simply too many moving parts. Okay, it was hard to get your head around it all. Now, what's happening now is that there's an attempt to try to get renew that systems thinking approach. And there's two approaches that have been put out. One is called the Schaefer Star, which Dave Marcoulier and I worked with Ron Schaefer to develop. The others is the Flores Community Capitals. The Flores Community Capitals has really been embraced by a lot of economic development and community development practitioners. I would like to have seen the Schaefer Star have a bigger impact, but the Flores Community Capitals is really kind of having an impact here. It's a way to kind of think about how all these different elements are interconnected, okay? And what we want here with the Flores Community Capitals, what we really want is we want vibrant communities. We're not talking about just job growth. We're not talking about business growth. We're talking about vibrant communities. We kind of shifted from economic growth to economic development. This is why we kind of talk in terms of community economic development, because it's not just jobs, it's not just income. We want vibrant communities. We want resilient communities. We want communities that are kind of innovative, that are able to bounce back. We want communities that people and entrepreneurs want to live in. And there's these various capitals that are part of that input process. Social capital. This is an area of work that I've been doing. I've been focusing a lot of energy on trying to better understand social capital. And I've been working with Tessa Conroy on this and John Halstead, a colleague at the University of New Hampshire. We have an edited book on trying to look at social capital in a community development setting. And if you're interested in that book, please let me know, and I'd be more than pleased to send you a copy of it. Natural capital, that's amenities. That is kind of natural amenities. That's kind of the resources that we have at our disposal. Historically, natural amenities was essentially if you had open fields, you planted on it. If you had forest, you cut it down. If you had minerals in the ground, you dug them up. Okay, we're thinking differently about those amenities now. When frac sand mining came on board really heavily a few years ago, okay, there was a real conflict about how do we use these natural resources. Do we use them in a non-consumptive way, which would be, say, tourism, recreation, second home ownership, or living in a natural setting? Do we want to use it that way, or do we want to dig it up, cut it down, plow it in? Okay, and a lot of the conflict came around those two perceived competing uses. Now, a lot of the work that I did in Western, it really kind of came down to simpler things. The one issue that the two opposing groups could agree on was truck traffic. There was real concern over truck traffic, and that's something that we can. Okay, how can we compromise? What can we do to actually kind of have our cake and eat it too? And one of the things that they zeroed in on was truck traffic. Built capital is basically infrastructure. Human capital, that's people. Okay, and it's not just technical skills. Okay, the university is always having this conversation of what is the mission of the university in terms of human capital. Is the mission of the university to teach technical skills, or is the mission of the university to teach critical thinking and problem solving skills? Ideally, we want to do both, but there's this kind of constant conversation as to what do we want in terms of human capital. We want leadership. We want civic engagement. We want critical thinking. We want kind of entrepreneurial thinking, and not entrepreneurial in the sense of business formation, but entrepreneurial in terms of willing to experiment with new things, willing to try new things, willing to learn from mistakes. Okay. I could spend the rest of the noon hour here talking about these types of things, but this is something that is really starting to have a fundamental impact on how communities go about thinking around community economic development. Okay. Now, this is kind of more the academic bent to it, and I'll go through this just really, really quickly. This is a classic economic model that has been used for a number of years. And it basically asks the question of, do people follow jobs or do jobs follow people? What we want to try to do with this is that we want to look at that interface between changes in employment, which is that E there, and changes in population. Okay. And we do this using statistical techniques. And we do this by looking at the relative impact of these different parameters on this regression equation. Okay, essentially we're looking at this alpha sub 2 versus beta sub 2. And by looking at and comparing those two parameters, we can kind of get insights into whether or not people follow jobs or jobs follow people. Now, this is a simple regression equation, and it's comparing the size of the coefficient of on population and employment. Okay, and what we're seeing here is that consistently jobs follow people. Throughout this entire time frame that I was looking at, that beta coefficient, that orange bar, is consistently larger than the blue bar, which is the population. So historically, people have always thought that people follow jobs. If you generate employment opportunities, people are going to move in and take those jobs. And that kind of thinking drives how you approach economic development. Okay. That's not necessarily true in the US. This little study kind of says, no, 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 no. It's people are following jobs. Okay. This is, again, this is part of the academic side. Is I made the statistical model a little bit more complex, and all people, jobs follow people. Okay. This is another, I'm testing the sensitivity of my results using different statistical techniques. But again, jobs follow people is a consistent finding. And then again, there's only one time period here, 2015 to 2019, except for that one time period. But consistently, jobs follow people. Okay, now, from an economic development perspective, okay, if we are interested in building vibrant communities, okay, that means that we need to have people that are kind of moving in, they're moving out. In the business community, let's talk about churn, business formation. Some businesses succeed, some don't succeed. That churn is actually a high churn rate is actually kind of a good thing because it means that the economy is dynamic. Okay. So what we're saying is that are we moving into a fourth wave? Okay. Are we kind of now thinking that we're shifting from a jobs view of economic development to a people view? Is it a realization that jobs follow people? Okay. Are we entering a systems thinking approach to economic development and growth? If we go back to the community or the floor's community capitals, and we start to realize that jobs follow people, well, what does this mean? Okay. This is from a study that John Halstead at University of New Hampshire and I did back in 1997. And what we were doing is that we were surveying small rural manufacturing firms in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, and Wisconsin. Okay, and we defined small as less than 100 employees. And this is back when we were doing, what we were looking at is we were trying to look at the impact of infrastructure, highways, roads, rail, water, sewer, air, all that kind of stuff, right? Traditional view of infrastructure. And one of the respondents wrote this on the side of the paper survey. Find an area that you want to live, then start your business. That response just really had a profound impact on how I think about economic development and growth within a community setting. Okay, because we were expecting to find that taxes are bad, infrastructure is good. We didn't find that. Okay, what we found is that quality of life mattered. Okay, taxes really didn't matter. Infrastructure really didn't matter. The one infrastructure that did matter was access to overnight delivery. That popped up, okay, which was kind of a surprise. But the quality of life component really struck home, okay? You go back and you look at kind of my research program over the years, this finding really kind of shifted how I think about things. That one quote. I wish I could go back and find that business owner. I'd like to buy him a beer and a cigar. Okay. Henry Barclay and Bow. This is part of the academic side of things. This is a study that a lot of my colleagues that I was presenting this to are familiar with. This was a study that they were looking at urban areas in South Carolina. Okay, they were at Clemson University. And what they did is they kind of carved South Carolina up into 9 urban areas. You had kind of the urban core, and then you had the surrounding area. Okay, and they were defining those 9 economic functioning areas. So say, think Eau Claire and all the areas that's kind of surrounding Eau Claire. Okay, and what they were looking at is that they were looking at spread and backwash effects. As urban areas grow, right, does that growth spread out into the surrounding rural areas, a spread effect, or does it backwash into the urban center? Okay, so basically rural resources are sucked into the urban center. Okay, and what they found is that quality of life is what drove everything. Okay, it wasn't taxes, it was quality of life factors that drove it. If urban centers had high quality of life and the surrounding rural communities had low quality of life, you would see this backwash effect into urban centers. Okay. If the urban center had low quality of life and the surrounding rural areas had high quality of life, you would see a spread effect. You would even see kind of this inversion where the urban centers start to decline and the rural areas, the surrounding areas actually experience growth. Quality of life matters. Okay. I brought in Amanda's paper because she had presented a very similar paper at this conference that I presented this. So this is trying to tie this back into another presenter at the program. And she found the exact same thing. She found that quality of life was one of the biggest influencers on economic growth. Okay. Placemaking as an economic development strategy. This is a term that I think people are starting to hang their hat on. And I think they're hanging their hat on it in 2 ways. One is, or 3 ways. One is entrepreneurship matters. Okay. If it wasn't for new business formation, the US economy would be shrinking. Okay. It's vital to a dynamic, vibrant community. That's number 1. Number 2, jobs follow people. So if jobs follow people, we should be focusing on the people. Okay. Not that we should ignore businesses. I'm not saying that. Okay. I'm not saying ignore businesses at all. I'm saying this is kind of a little bit of a pivot on the way that we think about things. Okay. And then there's this other research that's saying that quality of life really matters. So if we start to say, let's start focusing on making our community as an attractive place to live as possible. People want to live here. Okay. If people want to live here, then good things will happen. Okay. Well, quality of life matters. We're investing in schools, not necessarily to produce labor for local firms. We're investing in schools because people want to send their kids to good schools. we're investing in downtown redevelopment, partially to help the downtown businesses, okay, but also to make the downtown more attractive, that people want to live there, people want to go there. Okay, so this notion of placemaking, I think, is the new fourth wave of economic development. Okay, now should this fourth wave be top down or bottom up? Now, what do I mean by this? Top down, in the guise of this discussion, this is really, should the state be taking the lead on this, or should communities be taking the lead on this? Most of the research is suggesting that top down from the state is probably not going to work within this kind of a context. Okay, there's too much heterogeneity across Wisconsin for a top-down approach to work. Okay, a bottom-up approach, yes, these efforts should be community driven. Okay, it reflects the unique situations, the desires, the objectives of individual communities. Some communities say, hey, we want to promote tourism, but we don't want to become the next Wisconsin Dells. Okay, you may have another community saying, no, that's exactly what we want. Okay, it's community driven. Now, does the state play a role here? Yes, the state can play an extremely important role here in helping facilitate those discussions, providing technical resources, providing seed and grant money, providing other types of programs. The problem, though, is that we're still focused on jobs, jobs, jobs. This is a clip, a John Oliver clip that a student shared with me. And I think he was talking about the Amazon Second World Headquarters and the incentives. And he kind of really, I mean, if you're interested in a short, I think he goes on for like, I don't know, not even 15 minutes. He really kind of hits the nail on the head with this. But again, he's focusing on jobs, jobs, jobs. We still focus on jobs, jobs, jobs. Indeed, okay? The former mayor, I'm not sure, Nogales, mayor, is the first to announce running for the Arizona governor in 2022. Okay, those based at the job training, education, comprehensive, and jobs, jobs, jobs. Okay, when I think it was Scott Walker was first elected to governor, people asked him what his economic development policy was. He said jobs, jobs, jobs. Okay. The mayor of London, who's running for his second term, okay, kind of said, you know, what's his economic development? His primary focus would be jobs, jobs, jobs. Okay. The Prime Minister of Canada, you know, is jobs, jobs, jobs. Okay. So the idea really here is that despite what the research is saying, and the research is focusing on people following jobs, a lot of the focus here is we got to focus on jobs, jobs, jobs. Okay. Now, maybe at the state level and the federal level, maybe that's legitimate. But at the community level, should there be a little bit of a pivot in terms of that focus? It's more complicated than simply saying jobs, jobs, jobs. Okay.
Steve?
Indeed, with the recovery from COVID-19, we're finding that we're back to labor shortages. Okay. We're back to having the exact same discussion that we were having before COVID. The only wrinkle in that discussion is, you know, the $300 additional federal unemployment benefit. Is that affecting some people? For really low-paying jobs, low-paying occupations, occupations that are paying, you know, less than $10 an hour? Yeah, probably. But, you know, do we really want an economy based on $10 an hour jobs? That's a question that we have to ask ourselves. Okay. But in essence, what the research is suggesting is that we simply don't have enough people to fill the jobs that we have. We're generating more jobs than we are people. If any of you get the Wisconsin State Journal this morning, they had an editorial that we need to focus on. Their point on the labor shortage is that we're graying as a society, that we're having more people leave the labor force through retirement than we have new people entering the labor force. and that we're essentially generating more jobs than people, and that's leading to the labor shortage. Okay, and this is where immigration policy we may want to talk about. So if you get a chance, read that editorial because I think they raised some very good points. Okay, it was this
Steve,
morning's. Yes.
just a quick interrupt. We're about 10 minutes to the end of
Oh,
the hour, so I
geez.
just want to give you an
Okay.
FYI.
Okay. So why do politicians keep going back to smokestack chasing? Okay, why do we keep going back to the Foxcons? You can even talk about the Milwaukee Brewers. They're building a new stadium or we're leaving. Having grown up a Cubs fan, I was like, who cares? Until I actually went to a game at the old stadium. The Brewers needed a new stadium. Okay. Um, this again is more academic here. Institutional location theory. What we're saying here is that large firms, the Mercedes, um, the Brewers, the Foxcons of the world, they have outside leverage. Okay. They can essentially flex their muscles and they can exert kind of dominance in the market. And part of the problem here is that you're essentially, when you're playing this incentives game, you're playing a very, very complex poker game. The problem is that the company is holding their cards very close to the vest, but you're playing poker with the cards taped to your forehead facing out. Okay. It's not a fair game, but these large companies will play that game. That's why Amazon could get away with putting that out. Now, unfortunately, Peter Eisinger wrote a very influential book, The Rise of the Entrepreneurial State in 1988, that essentially said, good, we're moving away from big manufacturing recruitment strategies and we're focusing on entrepreneurship. He wrote a follow-up piece, I think it was 1995, The Demise of the State governments were going away from focusing on small business and entrepreneurship, and they started focusing, they would back the big businesses. Why? Peter Eisinger, as a political scientist, noted that state and federal level policymakers have very high discount rates. Okay, what that means is that they are looking at a 2-year election cycle, maybe a 4-year election cycle. They need to get things done and they need to get them done now. Okay, that's that high discount rate. Making investments today that may not have a payoff for 10 years, they're not interested in that. Okay, so these incentive programs, the Foxcons of the world, have large political payoff for a lot of state and local because they're thinking election cycles. Okay, communities, on the other hand, are really thinking more, how are we making this a better place for our children and for our grandchildren? Okay, I keep going back to this. Okay, make your investments, the community is attractive to people as much as possible. Find an area that you want to live and then start your business. Okay. And I think that's the fourth wave that we're moving into. We want good schools, not to feed the labor market, but to be attracted to families with children. Public safety. Do I feel safe walking my dog at midnight? Okay. That's high on the list. Parks, recreation, libraries. Okay. These kind of things are important to quality of life. Community fairs, festivals, art in the park, farmers markets, music on the square. Viable local business organizations, professional development opportunities for local businesses. We're not abandoning focusing on local businesses, but we're doing a bit of a shift. Okay. We're pivoting a little bit here. We're thinking broader than that narrow focus on jobs, jobs, jobs. Free public Wi-Fi. Active volunteer organizations, early child daycare. A lot of times we're thinking daycare in terms of labor shortages. No, well, that's part of it, okay? But early childhood education is an investment in human capital. Networking opportunities for small business owners and those interested in starting a business, okay? It is vital for new entrepreneurs, new business startups that have networks of people that they can tap into for information. Be open, receptive to newcomers to the community. This is really, the community has to be receptive to new ideas. And that means being receptive to people moving in from outside the community. Communities that kind of have this knee-jerk reaction of, well, you don't understand because you're not from here. That can be the kiss of death. Okay. Now, as an economist, I don't know how to address that. Okay. Um, does the strategy, the flow of these different waves of thinking replace? No. Rather, what we've got is, and again, that's why I said the waves, you kind of think one wave replaces the next. No, it's kind of an accumulation of them. Okay. Rather, what we're doing is that we're reorientating our thinking and focusing on types of development. You could kind of think of the first wave as kind of this narrow focus. The second wave is kind of broadening out, looking a little bit bigger. The third wave is a, we're broadening out our perspective even more. And then the fourth wave is kind of, okay, we're going to pivot here a little bit. Okay. So I think this might be a better way of thinking about it. Unfortunately, at the state level, in Wisconsin, it was under the, the thinking really was no, manufacturing the old legacy industries. We gotta recruit the old legacy industry businesses to come back, and we got to throw a lot of money at them. That's that first wave. That's too narrow. We need to think broader and deeper beyond that. I put my email address up here. If there's any thing that you would like to follow up on, drop me an email. And I thank you for, I'm going to stop sharing now and see if there's any comments or questions. See, in this presentation mode, I can't see the chat. So if there's anything that you would like to bring up, I'd love to talk about it. And we're scheduled to end at 1 o'clock, but I am more than willing to stay on the line as long as people want to chat.
Wonderful. And I think maybe we can take one question, and if people need to jump off as we hit the 1 o'clock, please feel free to do so. And those who would like to stick around and ask questions, please do so as well. And Steve, there are a number of comments in the chat. And so I'll open the floor and see if anybody has a question, and otherwise I'll start addressing the comments in the chat.
Oh, one other thing that Porter has done. And when you go to a regional science meeting, colleagues like myself and Tessa Conroy, Matt Kears, and you start talking about Porter, you start getting dirty looks because, there's nothing new in Porter's thinking. It's been around for years. It's been around for decades. But the one impact that Porter's had is that increasingly communities are realizing that they're part of a larger regional economic system, that working with your neighboring communities is extremely important. And I think that more and more communities in Wisconsin are realizing that they need to partner up with their neighboring communities to work. And I think that's a very positive outcome from Porter's clusters work. Thank you, Norm.
Steve, one of the comments, and I think Seth is off now, but when you had talked about the top-down versus the bottom-up approach, and more of the local bottom-ups approach is probably the more appropriate response. There was a comment about the need for state funding and as an incentive, and then also the giving a precedent to actually counting jobs as part of that funding as a stipulation. And I just wanted to offer an opportunity to respond.
That's right. And that's something that we, with our EDA University Center, is EDA's mandate that's given to them by Congress is jobs, jobs, jobs. So a lot of times when we think about how we kind of communicate the impact of our work to EDA, they have this natural bias of jobs, jobs, jobs. Okay. And what we're trying to say is that, no, what we're trying to do is that we're trying to help Wisconsin communities make more informed decisions. Okay. And the helping them make the decision is kind of our helping facilitate and process. And then the informed decision is kind of, well, what's the current research say? What's the current data say? We're trying to help you make more informed decisions. Okay. That may or may not result in job creation. That's a very difficult conversation to have with a lot of our federal funding partners because they're so focused on jobs. I think that most of the rank and file folks at the federal agencies, they get it. They understand it. But you're right, there is an implicit bias towards jobs. So I wish I had an easy answer for you, but I don't. I mean, for example, uh, what if you're working with five businesses that are on the verge of bankruptcy, and each one of those employed five people, you helped save all five of those businesses from going bankrupt, but now they only employ three people. From the metrics that the EDA, for example, wants is that no, geez, you lost 10 jobs, negative 10, when in reality, you saved 15. So it's kind of a, how do you present the story? How do you present the information?
Wonderful. And I want to give an opportunity for those who are still on the line. If you would like to ask a question, please feel free to do so. Dan, yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm reading at some of the chats. I think that for Jonathan, the WDC community development programs do not have a job requirement. I think that's good. I think that there's been, in Wisconsin, there has been a slow kind of pivot away from jobs to more sustainable development, more vibrancy. So I applaud that kind of shift, but it's very difficult. Norm Walls was on. I don't remember. I don't know if he's still on or not, but that he organized. Norm Walls a one of my mentors. He's at Northern Illinois University now. Um, Organized a multi-state study team to look at kind of university-based economic development programs, and you know we were all kind of in agreement on what works, what doesn't work. But when we got to notions of success, there was big division in the group, and notions of success really varies across communities. There was one colleague at the University of Missouri that said that his most successful program in 35 plus years of working in extension at Missouri was a series of community meetings that they did not have to call the sheriff's department. That was a huge success. How do you go back to a funding agency and report that we've had huge impact on the community because we didn't have to call the sheriff's department? This notion of success in this systems thinking broader fourth wave is much more difficult to quantify than simply chasing jobs.
Wonderful. And in early comments, Brian, I don't know if Brian's still on, but it was the acknowledgement, and there was some talk early as well about the importance of broadband. And I don't know if you want to speak to,
Yes.
if you have any data on that.
Yes, broadband is, and Brandon, could you cut and paste the link to the broadband report and put it in the chat, if you'd be so kind? Broadband is becoming necessary. It's a necessary condition for vibrant communities. It's no longer sufficient to well, it's not sufficient to have, it's necessary to have it. It's kind of like necessary to have transportation infrastructure. It's become a vital piece of the economic puzzle. If we were having this conversation 10 years ago, maybe not, but I think COVID has proven that you have to have broadband. Thank you, Brandon. Now, part of it is there's two parts to it. One is simply having broadband is not sufficient. You have to worry about quality. Extension's been involved in a number of community surveys on broadband. And one of the issues that keeps popping up is not necessarily access, but it's the quality of the connection. Okay. Yeah, I got broadband, but it's very spotty. It's on and off. There's also the thing that there's one major broadband provider in the state of Wisconsin that if you read the fine print, if you're getting they advertise 25.3, which is the definition of broadband by the federal government, but you're getting one and less than one. And people are saying, I'm not getting what I pay for. You read the fine print in the contract and there is no lower boundary. That company's getting a lot of pressure. So there's concerns about the quality of it. The second thing is that once we have it, what do we do with it? We're having, a lot of rural businesses, for example, that are now getting access to broadband and they're not quite sure what to do and how to use it. So I think that there's kind of a longer term. So there's a two-step process. One is the actual physical infrastructure and the quality of that infrastructure and the quality of the services. And then there's the adoption. What do we do with it? One of the things that surprised us is we were putting that broadband report together that Brandon has shared with you. One of the things that surprised us is the income disparity. Low income households, broadband is simply, they can't afford it. And even if they had broadband, they still couldn't afford it. So it's as we learn more about broadband, we're learning that it's not just the physical infrastructure. We have to go deeper than that.
All right. And again, I'll offer an opportunity if anybody would like to chime in.
Please unmute yourself and ask. I could talk all afternoon about this topic. Again, I'll put my email in the chat if you want to follow up.
Well, I'll just say that we're having an interesting, I don't want to say it's an age-related thing necessarily, but between the have broadband, have had it for a while, and still don't have it in terms of how their expectations for communication from, say, village government, chamber, things like that. And it's been interesting in this period to watch that sort of unfold. And now, as people are getting it, they're like, well, I have it now, everyone else has it. And it's sort of, there's like a little bit of a fight, people don't understand why we still need to print a few things, why we can't just stop putting things up at the post office for public notice, things like that.
I think you're right. And I think that it's a learning curve for smaller rural local governments to learn how to be more effective in communicating with the citizenry through social media and whatnot. And I can remember I put out a kind of an informal survey of town governments. Hey, do you use social media to kind of interact with your citizens? And the number of responses that came back and said, nah, that's what my grandkids do. It's like, oh, we have a ways to go. But I think COVID has hit us upside the head. Well, not only in terms of the pandemic, but in terms of how important access to broadband is.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. Yeah, we right now are like posting things, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Nextdoor, post office, banks, library.
Yes.
It's like a weird, the physical bulletin boards and all the, I'm responsible for all the other, websites and social media as part of my role. And it's both amazing and funny how one camp thinks the other is ridiculous.
It will change slowly. It will change. And I think that rate of change is speeding up. But this is where kind of networking with neighboring communities and finding out, how are you doing this? One thing might be maybe the county steps up and says, hey, we will provide this service for you. Then you run into the other thing of what do you do if you're using, say, Facebook? What do you do if you got somebody that's got an axe to grind and they just start piling on? There's a lot of newspapers that have, the public comment section at the bottom of newspaper articles. They have stopped doing that because you get people that basically have an axe to grind and they dominate, they derail. So some newspapers have just said, we're taking the public comments off. We're not going to do it anymore.
Yeah.
I don't know how to regulate that. Our social media, our center's social media, we don't have to worry about that because I'm not sure how many people follow it. So we don't have to worry about people coming in and having an axe to grind.
I just wanted to say that, well, with some of our non-extension guests having had a chance to ask questions first, I will say that it's been nice to see how you describe this fourth wave and the focus on placemaking and how it is sort of an economic development strategy. And that's something that we've been wrestling with on the placemaking team for a few years since I remember at one of our JSEP presentations, we shared some of what we were doing on the placemaking team with some colleagues. And one of the questions was, well, how do we talk about this in terms of economic development? And I admit that at the time I was kind of imagining, something I was familiar with, which is, well, in cases where you have large projects with a lot of public money and a lot of private money going into them, those you can quantify and you can talk about them, but really the explanation is more of a narrative explanation. Some of it's kind of hard to quantify that way, and some of the low cost projects can also be really valuable from if they work to make the community more attractive to people, and if they actually do improve quality of life and that sort of thing. But it's just nice to hear this explanation. Yeah.
Thank you, Nathan. There's got to be a balance. Well, we should probably have this with that. This is in extension conversation. But I think this is where business retention and expansion visitation programs can come into play, because in that kind of conversation is kind of, you can almost ask the business, why do you do business here? Well, I live here. Well, why do you live here? And kind of engage in that. And kind of, you're still trying to get, viable, profitable businesses, but you're going at it through a slightly different angle. Essentially saying, hey, we appreciate you doing business here. We want you to be more profitable. But, what makes this really a dynamic place for you to do your business?
All right. Well, we are just about 15 minutes over. And so I'm going to
Thank you,
stop
Becky.
recording.